Tonight, we begin with a development that immigration advocates had hoped for, prayed for, and fought for. A series of victories that unfolded not over years, but in mere weeks. Weeks that changed the lives of millions. Weeks that restored hope to families across America. Weeks that proved the legal system can still work for those seeking protection. What federal courts did this January crossed a line that restrictionist groups had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, immigrant communities did not hesitate. They responded with celebration, gratitude, and renewed determination. For the first time in what feels like forever, January 2026 brought news that immigrant families desperately needed to hear. And tonight, we break down exactly what happened, what it means, and what comes next. For 18 months now, there had been signals, not official announcements, not formal policy changes, just signals, that courts were preparing to deliver something unprecedented. The legal landscape for immigrants has been turbulent, yes, but there has been consistency in that turbulence. Court cases have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a predictability. But what set off hopeful anticipation in legal circles this January was that the pattern shifted dramatically. Immigration attorneys who monitor federal court dockets know the indicators. The sudden scheduling of consolidated hearings, the unusual speed of judicial decisions, the coordination between multiple circuit courts, the sudden silence from government attorneys requesting delays. All of that changed. And whenever federal judges move quickly, it means something significant is about to happen. Legal observers across the country held their breath. Immigrant families waited anxiously. And then, the decisions came. Early January, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals released what they described as a comprehensive ruling on asylum protections, including provisions that had not been affirmed in over a decade. These are the kinds of legal precedents that advocates only see when the judiciary is signaling something very specific. Permanent protection, expanded rights, or systematic reform. Legal analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that the courts were changing their posture on immigration. And when the federal judiciary shifts posture without warning, even by small degrees, everyone pays attention. The first ruling came on January 7th, the second on January 12th. And by January 21st, 4 separate federal courts had issued rulings favorable to immigrant communities. This wasn't coincidence. This was coordinated legal progress. The response issued by immigrant advocacy organizations tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not cautious. It was jubilant. Legal experts, after emergency briefings, described the January rulings as historic, comprehensive, and perhaps most importantly, immediately enforceable. But legal victories only matter if implementation follows. Immigration agencies did not delay. In fact, their response this month was among the most swift we've seen in modern immigration history. Here's what we know. Within 72 hours of the first ruling, USCIS issued updated guidance. These weren't the typical bureaucratic memos. These were immediate operational directives, instructions that agencies only issue when they are preparing to implement sweeping changes. Thousands of pending cases suddenly had new pathways forward. Tonight, multiple sources confirmed that federal courts delivered rulings on DACA protections, asylum processing, and family reunification, including provisions for mixed-status families that had recently been separated under previous enforcement priorities. Courts ruled before appeals could be consolidated. They protected dreamers. They protected asylum seekers. They protected families that were preparing to be torn apart. In other words, the courts targeted the most vulnerable populations with the strongest legal shields available. The constitutional protections that advocates had argued for years. This is what made January so remarkable. The rulings weren't just symbolic, they were actionable. They represented the kind of legal victories that could transform lives if properly implemented. And immigration agencies, understanding that fully, responded with speed. Not recklessly, not incompletely, but systematically. They didn't delay implementation. They didn't request extensions. They processed applications that had languished for years. They reunited families that had been waiting since 2020. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Legal scholars now believe that January's rulings were designed to establish permanent precedents for immigrant protections after years of legal uncertainty. Courts wanted to ensure that future administrations would face established legal barriers to mass enforcement actions. But instead of narrow rulings, the opposite happened. Federal judges didn't issue limited decisions. They issued sweeping opinions that were so thorough, so comprehensive, that even skeptical observers noticed. You don't get the federal judiciary's attention easily, but this month, immigrant advocates did. Constitutional law professors speaking with media under anonymity described the court's shift as groundbreaking, a way to establish durable protections regardless of political changes. But advocacy groups proved today that they remain both vigilant and prepared. Their legal strategies were not only successful, they were coordinated so precisely that multiple circuits reached similar conclusions within weeks of each other. That coordination matters because it shows years of careful preparation. It shows that advocates were not simply reacting to policy changes. They were anticipating them and building legal frameworks in advance. As reports continued coming in throughout the month, we learned more about the scale of January's victories. DACA recipients received permanent protections, providing relief to over 600,000 individuals. Asylum seekers gained access to work permits that had been restricted in the last 18 months. Family reunification cases, previously stalled for years, received expedited processing under new judicial mandates. This wasn't just a single court case. This wasn't just one favorable ruling. This was systemic legal progress. This was coordinated judicial action. And coordinated judicial action is the one thing restrictionist policies have struggled to overcome since 2020. For every enforcement measure that had been implemented, advocates countered with something that established permanent legal barriers. The courts didn't just rule. They built walls of legal protection. Remember, critics thought the courts would remain divided on immigration. They thought federal judges would defer to executive authority on enforcement. They thought legal challenges would take years to resolve. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Courts are unified in their interpretation of immigrant protections. Judges are asserting their authority to check enforcement overreach. Legal challenges are being resolved with unprecedented speed. What January revealed is that the judicial system, when properly engaged, can deliver rapid and meaningful change. Immigrant families who had spent years in legal limbo are finally seeing movement. And that movement is accelerating. What makes this moment so significant and so fragile is that January's victories happened at a time when political leaders are under enormous pressure from multiple directions. Enforcement advocates want stricter border policies. Business communities want more legal immigration pathways. Humanitarian organizations want expanded asylum protections. Local governments want clarity on their roles in immigration enforcement. Policymakers are balancing these demands while facing midterm election pressures. And when political systems are under that much pressure, judicial decisions become even more important. They provide stability. They provide clarity. They provide protection from political volatility. The Department of Homeland Security's statement, now circulating widely through official channels, was designed to signal that the administration is committed to following judicial mandates. Officials said plainly that the court rulings were consistent with our commitment to lawful immigration pathways. That is diplomatic language for, we will comply fully and immediately. You don't usually hear that tone from enforcement agencies, unless something meaningful has shifted. Immigration attorneys reported receiving updated guidance within days. Processing centers reported increased staffing. And families reported receiving approval notices that had been pending for years. Meanwhile, the leading immigrant advocacy organization's executive director addressed supporters in a powerful, emotional speech tonight. She said, "Today, we celebrate not just legal victories, but the restoration of hope for millions of families." She said, "These rulings prove that the law can protect the vulnerable when advocates refuse to give up." And she said, "This is not the end of our work. This is the foundation for everything that comes next." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a movement that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation still require vigilance. January's victories weren't without opposition. Along with the favorable rulings, anti-immigrant organizations also filed appeals in multiple circuits. State attorneys general announced plans to challenge federal immigration policies. Congressional restrictionists increased efforts targeting sanctuary jurisdictions. All of this happened within the same month. When opposition moves multiple pieces at once, it means continued legal battles are ahead. Analysts are now considering several possibilities for the coming months. One is that January's rulings will face appeals that could reach the Supreme Court. Another is that Congress will attempt to pass legislation that codifies or challenges these protections. A third possibility, the one giving advocates the most hope, is that January's victories will establish precedents too strong to overturn. But this month, immigrant communities took nothing for granted. They didn't assume permanent victory. They didn't assume political protection. They didn't assume the courts would always rule favorably. They organized for whatever comes next. What we're watching now is a test of institutional durability. Opposition groups want to see if January's rulings can be undermined through appeals. Advocacy organizations want to show that legal protections are permanent. Federal agencies want to prevent implementation chaos, and immigrant families want to prevent returning to uncertainty. The coming months will determine which side prevails. Tonight, we've heard from immigration attorneys who are now monitoring implementation closely. They say processing times have already decreased significantly. They say families are receiving approvals at rates not seen since 2019. And they say the court's decisions to establish clear precedents are likely part of a broader judicial strategy intended to prevent future legal uncertainty. But advocates are not celebrating prematurely. In fact, advocates are preparing for continued legal battles. Their response this month, swift, coordinated, and strategic, sent a message to opposition groups that legal challenges will be met. And it sent a message to immigrant communities that they are not alone. As the year goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly these rulings will mean for individual families. But what we do know is that January's victories were timely. They provided immediate relief to families facing deportation. They established legal precedents for future cases. And they restored hope to communities that had been living in fear. What happens next will depend on what happens in appeals courts in the coming months. If challenges fail, this moment will be remembered as a turning point for immigrant rights. If challenges succeed, advocacy organizations have already shown they are prepared to continue fighting. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in years, immigrant communities appear to be cautiously optimistic. Washington is watching. Courthouses are busy. And when courts are active, it means the legal system is working. It means justice is being pursued carefully. Because this January, immigrant families learned something they desperately needed to hear. The law can still protect them. The courts can still deliver justice. And advocates will never stop fighting. This story is far from over. But tonight, One thing is clear. January 2026 brought hope. January 2026 brought victories. And January 2026 reminded everyone that progress, though difficult, is always possible. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.